would like to start with a very warm welcome to all of you, to us here at JP Infonet, and today's webinar, Commercial Lawyers and Climate Change. My name is Kajsa Palmberg, and I'm Business and Marketing Director here at JP Infonet, and I stand here together with Annette Magnusson from Climate Change Counsel. We are thrilled to have so many of you with us here today. And since we have quite a few international listeners who might not have heard of us before, I will just give a short introduction to our business and what we do. So we are a family company, Swedish-based, with a core business to efficiently provide legal information and knowledge through web-based services and courses. We put great effort and pride in our legal experts and technical development and strive to constantly find new ways of making life easier for our customers through powerful search methods and relevant legal analysis. We also try to find ways to contribute with our capabilities and technical platforms in questions and areas of great importance. And that's actually why we are here today. Many companies and industries express strong support for global climate goals and have set high climate ambitions. Our collaboration with the Climate Change Counsel aims to increase climate competence within the different practices for commercial lawyers. We believe this knowledge is needed in order for the law firms to stay relevant for clients in climate transition, and will most likely increase their business opportunities on top of contributing to the global climate goals. So for our Swedish participants, we have a course at the 16th of November that will help you get started with the work. And for our international listeners, and of course also for our Swedish listeners, I encourage you to save the date 18th of April for a trip to Stockholm in order to participate in the conference Law and Climate Change Summit, which will be given for the first time in collaboration with Climate Change Council. But back to today. So first we will hear a brief summary of the report written earlier this year by Annette Magnusson and Anja Ip from Climate Change Council. And then we will listen to a panel discussion with very highly ranked experts that we are much honored to have with us here today. And so with no further ado, I would like to hand over to you, Annette. You're one of the co-founders of Climate Change Council and will take us through the report. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kajsa, and hello everyone. And again, on behalf of Climate Change Council, warm welcome to this webinar, where we will talk about commercial lawyers in the climate transition. And as Kajsa mentioned, we will do this as a starting point from a report that we published earlier this year on commercial lawyers in Sweden and their work on climate change issues. And we do this against a background on the fact that in recent years we have been able to see that in the commercial law sector we have seen increasing momentum for climate change awareness in the legal sector. And we have seen how lawyers have become more and more active in this space. International law firms have started to establish climate change practice groups specifically addressing these issues. We have seen new NGOs establish themselves and working with the legal contribution to the climate change issues from different perspectives. And we hear more and more about the concept of climate conscious lawyering. So it was against this background of the international development that we were interested to learn more about what it was like at the Swedish law firms in this context and see how the ambitions also of the Swedish companies was reflected among the lawyers who represent and advise the Swedish companies. Swedish companies are quite active and quite at the forefront when it comes to tackling the climate change challenge in mitigation and adaptation efforts. We see this in massive investments in electrification, green steel, renewables, and a thriving scene for green startups, or green tech startups. Swedish business has always also been pushing Swedish policymakers to become more active in this space. So to the point that 1 year ago, 1 week before the general election in Sweden, we could see more than 220 representatives of Swedish business in a joint open letter to policy makers and politicians all across all political parties, encouraging them to talk more about the climate crisis in the debate leading up to the election, and to stop hindering the climate transition as they saw it. So this is some of the background to our study that we conducted earlier this year. And the overarching question that we asked as we set up for the study was that, how do Swedish law firms encounter the climate transition in their daily work with clients? And how do lawyers perceive their own role in the climate transition and the role of commercial law? And can we draw any conclusions on this? What will be the future role of commercial lawyers ahead when it comes to climate change mitigation and adaptation? We published this report right before the summer. It is all in Swedish, but we have an English executive summary. And as we do here today, sharing more and more of the contents for an international audience, we will continue to do so also after today. But in essence, the research conducted of 3 parts. Research, where we were looking at the intersection between climate change, business perspectives and commercial law perspectives, but also looking at what law firms in Sweden say about climate change, for example, on their websites. We interviewed representatives from some of the largest law firms in Sweden, and in total we met with more than 30 representatives from Swedish law firms. And we also talked with lawyers outside of Sweden and representatives from business. And finally, as part of the study, we did an online survey spread widely across the Swedish commercial law sector. And here we received 200 responses, so we had 200 respondents from the survey. And looking at the survey, we could see that the respondents represent a wide range of seniority, if you look at this graph here. And we can also see that the respondents represented a wide range of different expertise. So representing very wide range of different practice groups within the law firms. And this is something we describe more in detail in the report. We had Swedish law firms, but also international law firms with Swedish offices represented among the respondents. All of the statistics that are represented or presented in the report have a base in the online survey. But we could also note that many of the findings from the survey, as presented later in the report, also found strong support in many of the interviews that we conducted as part of this project. So before I hand over to the panel, I thought I'd take this time to share a few observations from the survey and the conclusions that could be drawn. And first, when we were analyzing the general focus of the law firms on environment, climate, and sustainability, we could see that almost 50% of the firms describe their own carbon footprint or environmental impact on their website. A major share of the law firms also have adopted policies for environment and sustainability, but few law firms have specific climate policies. Few law firms in Sweden market specific expertise of relevance for the climate transition. However, though, many law firms demonstrate a strong expertise in precisely those areas that are associated with the climate transition and work actively with clients in this space. So that includes, for example, projects relating to renewable energy, again, electrification, green bonds, and similar client matters. 53% of the respondents report that climate issues never come up in their work with clients. But 45% state that they do work on climate-related issues with their clients. This could be because clients want them to assist them in analyzing the climate risks associated with their business and how to act upon these risks. It could be that the client's business is directly associated with the climate transition, again, going back to the different matters relating to, for example, renewable energy and electrification. And it could be because there are laws and regulations that affect the client's business that are motivated by the climate transition. For example, provisions or laws and regulations relating to climate disclosures and reporting. So the climate transition appears absent from many lawyers' self-image, but still they are quite involved in the practicalities when it comes to actually making the climate transition happen. So I think this duality could be something that maybe we will have the panel explore later this hour. Another area that the survey targets is the role of commercial law in general in the climate transition and commercial lawyers' responsibility in the transition. Do lawyers have a specific responsibility in the climate transition in the situation when advising clients? Should lawyers include climate transition perspectives in these conversations when advising clients? Here, as you can see, the responses vary. 12% say that external counsel should always include climate transition perspectives when advising clients. 31% says, well, only if specifically asked to do so by the client. This is a question that is closely associated with the concept of climate-conscious lawyering. And what does that really mean? What are the boundaries for climate-conscious lawyering? And this is a very, very interesting question that is being discussed more and more in Sweden and, of course, outside of Sweden as well. And I think that's also something that will be very interesting to hear more from the panel on this precise issue. What does that entail, climate-conscious lawyering? One of the elements of climate-conscious lawyering has been the extent to which lawyers should or should not take on client work that could be deemed to go in opposite direction as a climate transition. So should law firms decline to take on client work with clear negative impacts for the climate transition? And as you can see here on this slide, the response is quite divided. Again, much to be discussed on this topic. What should be the discussions and what should be the priorities for the law firms in these particular situations? And finally, I wanted to conclude with sharing the one conclusion where we could see that there was big consensus among the respondents. And that is where most respondents agree that there is a need for more knowledge about the climate transition and how it affects the clients. So even if the lawyers at the law firms are not always clear on their own precise role in the climate transition, we know that, of course, lawyers will always listen to the clients. And we believe that there is a strong business case for all lawyers to become more climate change aware and to include the climate change approach in their conversations with their clients. But to be able to do so, to be able to meet their clients on this platform, it requires knowledge and it requires awareness. And we hope that this report will be a good start, and also that the conversation that we will be having here today also could be a part of that continued conversation for lawyers and with their clients. So with this brief introduction of the report, I'm very happy to hand over to my colleague and partner in Climate Change Counsel, Anja Ip, who will introduce her panel and lead the conversation for the next hour.
Thank you, Annette. All right, so my name is Anja Ip, and I'm very happy to follow Annette's excellent summary of the report. She's given us an overview of the findings and sort of the setting, the state of play now in Sweden. And the idea now with this panel for the next 45 minutes is to broaden the perspective and look at these issues from sort of different viewpoints. And for that purpose, we have with us three excellent speakers. I assume that they're up on the screen. Yes. So first up, we're going to hear from Lara Duvertsidis. She's an Australian lawyer working at the International Bar Association. She leads IBA's projects in climate and business and human rights law. And importantly, she also heads the IBA's engagement with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and represents them at the COP meetings. After Laura, we're going to hear from Alistair Cameron. He is the climate change and the climate change policy advisor at the the Law Society for England and Wales. And in that capacity, he very much works to engage lawyers in fighting climate change. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Maria Pia Hope. She is the managing partner of Vinge, one of Sweden's top law firms. And she's also a banking and finance lawyer. And last year, importantly in this context, she was awarded Sweden's prestigious Boss of the Year award for what the jury called her modern and sustainable leadership. So we're gonna hear from each of our speakers. I'm gonna give them about 5 minutes each, and then after that, we're gonna have a bit of a discussion. So I was thinking we can start at the global level with you, Laura, speaking from the perspective of the International Bar Association. Go ahead.
No problems. Well, I just want to say firstly, thank you to JP Infonet and to the Climate Change Council for having me today and for putting together this very important event. As Annette demonstrated with some of her findings in her pie chart, the IBA recognises there is a pressing need to upskill legal professionals and increase climate capacity and climate literacy in both domestic and international legal settings. To quote our UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the launch of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6 assessment report, he said, "Our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once." And we take that also in as part of our legal work. So just a bit of background on the IBA and what we've done to date in the climate space. Back in 2014, the IBA published a report titled Achieving Justice and Human Rights in an Era of Climate Disruption, which contained a number of actions that countries and businesses could take to better align. And of course, this was pre-Paris. So when one reads it now, it's interesting to see what they got right and what was yet to come. In 2020, the IBA published its model statute for proceedings challenging government failure to act on climate change. And of course, we're now seeing litigation that does that also. But most importantly, for the work that I do, in May of 2020, the IBA published our climate crisis statement. And this says that the legal profession must be prepared to play a leading role in maintaining and strengthening the rule of law and supporting responsible, enlightened governance in an era marked by the climate crisis. So importantly, for law associations, law societies, bar associations, it included guidance for them and to demonstrate a commitment to act collaboratively and engaging with others. I just want to draw out principle 4 of this statement as it might relate to anyone working in any national bars or local bars. We recommended that bar associations, law societies, and similar bodies around the world consider, firstly, engaging with law students and schools concerning education on legal elements of the climate crisis and its impact on human rights. Secondly, developing practical educational tools for qualified lawyers using a continued legal education program, which is directly related to Annette's findings about a lack of awareness of climate literacy. The third thing that we recommended is for bar associations and law societies to establish a committee to focus on the climate crisis and its consequences, where it not already be in place. And this would encourage lawyers and legal practices to actively support, engage with, and record their efforts internally to combat the climate crisis. Finally, clause 4 of this recommendation called upon lawyers and legal practices in their respective jurisdictions to report their efforts in combating the climate crisis and the work of their committee to cross comparison and develop best practice guidelines within their own jurisdiction, but also to look at what other jurisdictions were doing. So I draw that out because since 2020, since this statement was released, we are seeing a real uptick at local levels of different bars and law societies around the world. And at our events, at COP27 in particular, the IBA partnered with the Law Society of England and Wales, the Brazilian Bar Association, and the American Bar Association, which you might think a bit of a motley crew, and you would be right. The 4 of us, we banded together, and for the first time, as far as we're aware, we hosted an official Blue Zone session at COP for lawyers specifically. And what happened was a number of lawyers in different bar associations around the world were in the room and came up to us afterwards wanting to know how to collaborate with us and how to introduce a climate resolution or a guidance or wherever it was on their journey. And so in just to finalize, I have 2 points. Firstly, I just wanted to give a brief snapshot of what I've seen since this statement was released. And second, just to finish off by stating what we're doing now as the IBA. So just to give you a bit of a snapshot of who's doing what where. In 2019, the American Bar Association issued a climate change resolution. Back in 2011, the Canadian Bar Association did. In 2020, you have the IBA climate guidance. And then in 2021, you see the Law Council of Australia issue a climate policy statement. The American Bar Association issued another resolution. The Japan Federation of Bar Associations issued a declaration to aim for a sustainable society averting the climate crisis. The Canadian Bar Association attempted another resolution, which failed. In 2022, we see different jurisdictions again introducing resolutions. And in 2023, the Council of Bars of Europe issued an initial statement on climate change, as well as a corporate social responsibility statement on as it relates to legal profession. And in Brazil, we have the recommendation to combat the effect of climate change, which my colleague Leticia Campos Melo helped introduce and was quite a path for them to do it, but they did do it. And so I just want to congratulate them, if anyone from Brazil is listening. And just to round out, in terms of what I do on the day-to-day and what the IBA does on the day-to-day, it really is a convening power that we have to help monitor and share information between bars, to let them know that they're not alone in wanting to go on this journey. In fact, it seems that a lot are already on this journey, and we'll hear from my colleague Alistair on the amazing work that the Law Society of England and Wales is doing. The other thing that we're doing is really committing to educating lawyers around the world, being a bit of an educational platform with certain seminars on different aspects of the Paris Agreement, becoming Paris Agreement literate, which we're hoping will be released later in the year. And finally, we're running over the course of the year a number of thematic webinars to bring in lawyers across the world on various topics. The last one we did was focusing on unlocking finance in Africa. So with that, I'll let you go. I would direct you all to our Climate Crisis webpage, and I'm available if you would like to talk any further about what I have spoken about. We're very much here to support all lawyers in tackling the climate crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear you talk about sort of this uptick in climate change statements and the climate crisis statement and so on over the past few years. Of course, like, you know, the cynic in me would say, well, are we sure that anything is actually changing, right? It feels good to release a statement, but do you have a way of estimating whether these statements have an impact or to what extent actual change is happening? I guess, I mean, either anecdotally, perhaps, like just in the minds of lawyers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Briefly.
I mean, it's a great question, right? And it's a difficult thing to measure because each jurisdiction is unique in their own way and has different language barriers. But what I will say is, I think getting an individual bar association or law society on their journey of becoming more climate conscious happens in stages. And we saw this, I'll give Canada as an example. They were the first in 2011 to issue a resolution, but it was quite a narrow one as it related to, I think, government lawyers. In 2021, they tried again for another resolution for to detail lawyers for climate justice. Now, in that instance, it failed because they didn't have the support internally to do it. I think it is a journey that people have to go on individually within bars to learn more about tackling the climate crisis. And once that support is there across the board, you do see a change in multiple ways. First, what I see anecdotally is first a resolution, a group that is formed internally, ultimately leading to what we've seen in England and Wales is a climate crisis guidance. Now, in that instance, and Alistair will talk about it, you see a direct influence on the way lawyers conduct themselves in their jurisdiction. Now, that is the first and only example we have. But we've got to realize it's only been 2 or 3 years that we've seen a surge in resolutions. So I have every confidence that guidance will follow, because that is the natural next step. And once guidance follows, then depending on who the regulator is, we are going to see some change. And I remain optimistic, because it's either optimism or it's we may as well pack up now. So I'm keen to hear from Alistair as to how he's going.
That's a fantastic segue to hand the metaphorical microphone over to Alistair. Since the Law Society of England and Wales has been one of the most active bar associations on this issue. So Alistair, we can't wait to hear from you. Tell us what you guys have been up to.
Yeah, no, thank you, Anya, and thank you for having me here today and to speak to, again, wonderful to speak to an international audience on this issue, because as we all know, lawyers working in one jurisdiction on this issue is simply not enough. We need coherent and consistent action across all jurisdictions. So it's great to be speaking to an international audience today. So Lara provided a little bit of background as to what we've been doing in the Law Society of England and Wales in terms of we first had a resolution, then we first had the guidance this year. But to provide a little bit more further context as to how we got there and what this guidance contains, that's what I aim to do over the next 5 minutes or so. So there's been, prior to our resolution being published, and also indeed the IBA's climate crisis statement, there were developments both in the activist stage internally within and between law firms themselves on addressing climate change. So that's an important dimension to remember. This included protests specifically run by lawyers on the perceived role that lawyers had in facilitating or exacerbating the climate crisis. And that occurred outside the Premier Court in England and Wales at the Royal Courts of Justice. It has also included reports which were done in England and Wales, which aimed to highlight law firms' activities or an inactivity in the sector, similar to the excellent report Anna outlined that was conducted in Sweden this year. So that's really, really important. However, as well, law firms have driven action through cross-firm initiatives such as the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, which is a kind of subsidiary of the UN Race to Zero, similar in reflection, I guess, to the other net zero alliances which exist in banking, finance, so on and so forth, which aims to capacity build firms and create a commitment to restrict warming to 1.5 degrees, or indeed the Chancery Lane project, which you might have heard of, which develops climate change clauses aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement that lawyers can embed into contracts today. So some real tangible pieces of action to get your arms around. Then there was also indeed discussion in academic forums as a result of the practical challenges, as indeed outlined by the report that Annette said at the beginning, on climate change and raising their duties, raising awareness around their potential duties of care, competency to advise on climate-related legal risks as the impact of climate change become more widespread and profound. So in a bit of the larger domestic context in England and Wales, the UK set a net zero target for 2050 under the Climate Change Act 2008, and the Act puts in place a number of carbon budgets that act as stepping stones to the 2050 net zero target. And the UK has legally binding targets to reduce emissions by at least 68% by 2030 and 78% by 2035. So really, we're not that far from these targets, and indeed that is why lawyers need to be involved. So in response to that, the need for all sectors, including the legal sector, to continue to achieve the UK's emissions targets, the Law Society published its climate change resolution and its climate change guidance. Further pieces of climate change guidance specific to different practice areas and sectors will be published going forward as well. So looking at other areas like directors' duties in greenwashing, looking at areas such as conveyancing transactions, looking at other areas such as property, increasing property and regulation standards as we see the built environment decarbonize. So the guidance was consulted and worked on by over 100 solicitors and dozens of committees, NGOs, other bars and law societies, regulators, academics, a whole wealth of experts. And it took just over a year to publish from its initial drafting phase. It has been extremely well received by the sector, including by large commercial law firms, as well as other regulators, NGOs, professional bodies, and international bars and law societies around the world. And as Lara alluded to, currently other bars and law societies in other jurisdictions are considering or working on their own similar guidance for lawyers and law firms, which of course will respond to their specific jurisdiction's needs and legislative requirements. So what does the guidance cover? So it covers how solicitors, well, firstly, it's in two parts. Part A is focused for what law firms need to be doing, and part B focuses on what solicitors should be doing in the client-solicitor relationship. So it covers how solicitors can reduce their climate impact and manage their practice in a way which is aligned with the transition to a decarbonized economy, how climate change may affect solicitors' professional duties, and that's in part B, the climate legal risks that result from the physical and transition risks caused by climate change, and how those risks may impact the solicitor-client relationship and a solicitor's advice to their client. So in part A, in brief, it discusses how lawyers and law firms need to manage their emissions, as many organizations undertake a carbon footprint to determine which of their activities are responsible for emissions. So the guidance explains the most likely source of emissions for law firms is your scope 3, and it points to the direction of, SBTI, GHG protocol, and so on. So the guidance recommends to manage their emissions, law firms should be setting science-based targets, and that's all law firms. Of course, smaller to medium-sized law firms will be a little bit more challenging, but particularly for those large law firms, they should be considering doing this at this stage. It also discusses the issue of advised emissions. These are emissions associated with the matter upon which solicitors advise and are likely to be the more significant than their scope 1 through 3 emissions. These emissions are coming under increased client and stakeholder scrutiny in England and Wales, and are now being considered and discussed by large law firms in England and Wales as a result. Further, a group of law firms who have signed up to a charter called the 1.5 degree Charter have committed to developing and implementing such a methodology. And if you'd like to find out more, recently, just this week, a white paper was published by Matthew Gingell at Oxygen House, which I can link in the chat, and it goes a little bit more in detail as to what that means. But we would indeed encourage that firms, as the guidance says, are committed to pursuing the 1.5 degree goal, should consider how they might be able to influence the reduction of advised emissions in line with their broader target setting. And the guidance goes into a bit more detail as to how they might be able to do that. It also discusses greenwashing. So the guidance states that to avoid the possibility of action of greenwashing under the Competition and Marketing Authority, Green Claims Code, and or the SRA Code of Conduct, law firms should ensure that their marketing and pitch materials do not overstate their climate targets or progress. This could also be on pro bono work they're potentially doing, any specialist advice they might claim that they might be able to offer. So it's important that if claims are made that concerning sustainability, that they are able to stand up to external scrutiny. And this is the first time guidance of this kind has been applied on greenwashing specifically to law firms. It also discusses how law firms as employers are impacted by climate change, on particularly how to attract and retain employees, particularly on how their stance is to do with climate change. And this is, of course, each law firm's consideration as to how they might operate on this issue, but that might include what sort of clients they're taking on, how they can accommodate certain lawyers within their firm who might not be comfortable with acting for such clients. And that is a specific regulatory requirement that we do have in England and Wales, that lawyers can refuse instruction. But we, of course, as to uphold access to justice and rule of law, do not encourage that that is taken in any specific circumstance, but it is indeed a consideration law firms and lawyers should be making. Part B discusses climate change risks, and as I said, how they translate to legal risks, both in terms of translation and physical risks. And the guidance explains how legal risks might impact a solicitor's practice and why a solicitor should take into account with them. So I would encourage you to look at the guidance if you want more detail on that. And then it, of course, discusses how that interfaces with their professional duties. So which professional duties? These are fundamentals of professional liability in not only England and Wales, but other jurisdictions as well. So your duty of care, your duty to warn, duty to disclose, and duty to uphold service and competency levels in this context. So again, I would encourage those who are interested to read the guidance to get a little bit more detail on that. It also discusses the SRA principles, which are the ethical principles which underpin solicitor practice. So it specifically looks at the duty to obtain public trust and integrity, in the context of how climate change is developing for solicitors' practice. And then lastly as well, it talks around solicitors' key kind of issues on a practical level, whether you're a high street small firm or a large firm. How do you deal with new instructions in this context? How does that impact your scope of the retainer? Does that need consideration? Your impact upon your professional indemnity insurance, again, another key consideration. And it also covers how in-house solicitors will need to respond to this issue, conscious that they don't have a retainer they're instructed upon. They've got a unique role that they can fulfill. And to that end, that can be seen as much as an opportunity as indeed a risk to the organization upon which they advise. So I'll pause there, and hopefully that was too much of an information overload, but as you can see, we've been relatively busy, but and glad to
yes,
be off the platform.
Indeed. Yeah, I can imagine that there are a lot of people watching and listening out there thinking, you know, wow, this is just an overload of information and inspiration and so on. But luckily, there's you can view this, that it will be available on YouTube, so you can pause and write down all these tips and pieces of advice. One of the things that I just wanted to remark on was this issue of advised admissions, right? So this is now becoming increasingly becoming a topic of discussion, right? That law firms, of course, you look at scope 1, 2, 3 emissions of a law firm, they're probably quite small, but when you look at the emissions resulting from the advice that the law firms provide to their clients, it can be significantly larger. But something that was raised in a lot of the interviews that we did for this study was the difficulty of quantifying those emissions. Like, how do you actually? So a lot of the people that we talked to, they did raise this issue. How do you decide? How do you quantify, or how do you calculate which part of the clients or the emissions resulting from a certain legal matter, how much should be attributed to the legal advice? So I too saw this white paper that came out last week. So I think everybody should look at it. It does propose a model for quantifying advised emissions, and it's also it's sort of a beginning of this conversation. And with that, I want to, because now we're sort of down to the level of the law firm, so let's hear from Maria Pia Hope. What does it look like on the level of the law firm?
Well, thank you, Anya. Really interesting to listen to both Lara and Alistair, clearly. So I was one of the lawyers participating in the survey, interviewed, and already when I did take part, I thought it was an excellent survey to have done here in the Swedish market. I think it's really beneficial that we have some sort of idea of where we stand in relation to these matters. Everything from, you know, what do we actually advise clients on, and what are firms doing, what could we be doing? So I really welcome the survey. As it happened, it fit very neatly into a piece of strategy work we were doing at Vinge at the time. So very valuable, I thought. And just to place us, you know, in the universe of respondents. So we're, as was said initially, a fairly large firm. We're around 500 people. Then again, I think it's important to highlight as well, that makes us one of the big ones here. Whereas if you compare to, well, Cliff Chance, the Managed Circle firm, I mean, they are so much larger, 20 times larger in terms of turnover and people. So I think fair to say from the beginning that we often look at the UK market for inspiration and often copy what happens there. Having said all that, I think one thing to say also is that we have, and a lot of other Swedish firms have done that, the Nordic firms have done that for a long time, had quite a sort of reasonable agenda in terms of sustainability. I think that's part of the culture here up in the north, and you know, that's encompassed quite a lot of different issues. I think for us, for instance, at Vinge, it's been gender diversity. That's been one of the sort of key things that we have focused on, and I think, you know, as the survey shows, a lot of firms here certainly have an ambition when it comes to environment, the climate. It's obviously something that's generally discussed widely in society, and you know, most of us would have an environmental policy at least, and we have an ambition when it comes to well, essentially reducing our carbon footprint both in terms of office space and how we organize our office and how we travel. We measure that. We have a target. We try year on year to reduce our carbon footprint. And we do that because we think it's the right thing to do, quite simply, not so much driven actually by what our clients want and what people want, although I have to say that that's increasingly also on people's agenda. One nice thing that I would like to say is that it's not necessarily only the young lawyers and people coming in. It's actually quite a lot of senior lawyers too who think that this is really important for us to drive. So I think that's encouraging generally. And then looking at what we do in relation to clients, we do advice. I sort of looked into that as part of the survey. It was good exercise in itself to see what sort of practice areas climate comes into. And I think the simple answer is a lot of different areas. I mean, obviously there's direct advice on climate legislation, for instance, emissions rights, trades, reporting obligations. But we also help set up funds to fulfill green requirements. We advise on financing of green bonds, on climate risks and prospectuses, long array of different practice areas, really. And I think, well, I don't have the figures to prove it, but I think anecdotally it's on the increase, is my feeling. Obviously, we've invited that's thing to add. One thing to add, we've advised clients on new renewable energy for a long time. I mean, wind farms, but also solar energy. So I think there's a lot of advice in the area. But perhaps one thing that many firms, and I think it's the same is the case with ESG, broadly speaking, is that it just because it's essentially in a lot of different practice areas, it's fairly difficult to get your arms around it and to sort of figure out how to profile it, and that's probably why you don't find so much, as Annette was mentioning, on law firms' websites over here. One thing I thought was very interesting in the report was this idea of whether you should advise clients on climate impact, irrespective of whether they ask you to do so or not. And I think the percentage of people, respondents, saying, well, if they don't ask you, you shouldn't, bring it up, was pretty. Well, I think it was something like. But it's quite a large part who said that, and I think that's an interesting observation, because I think that we as lawyers have an opportunity more than anything else to highlight things for our clients. We've done that, for instance, in the field of gender diversity. It's something that we think is really important internally, that we bring up more senior women, have reasonable equality between men and women at partner council level, and we worked towards that. Last year we brought, because we do a lot of M&A transaction, that whole topic out into the M&A market by introducing into our due diligence request list specific questions pertaining to the existence of gender diversity policies, whether you are gender diverse in key roles and boards, etc., just so as to bring up the issue when we speak to our clients in connection with M&A transactions, where we do very regularly. And I'm thinking that a similar thing can actually be done also in relation to climate matters, that we can talk to our clients without them asking us, and probably we ought to. We have an opportunity there as lawyers, and without sort of rushing ahead of time, because I'm not allowed to, I will say that we are actually going to launch something in 2 weeks' time as part of our big all people conference. We're bringing everybody in Vinga together, and that's to do with climate and what we can be doing. That's something we looked into, so we're quite excited about that. But I will stop there since it's not yet launched.
That's exciting. We'll keep an eye on your website and see what it is that's being launched in a couple of weeks. This is a very interesting issue that you raised, Maria-Pia, about whether we as lawyers have to wait for the client to raise the question of whether a particular legal matter impacts or perhaps is impacted by the climate transition. Like, is that a question of legal ethics? Is it a question of good business on the part of the lawyer, the law firm? Or should this be demand driven? Like, should should the climate transition be reflected in the lawyer's work as a result of demand from clients. And in the interest of time, Arepia, we already heard you speak about it, but I want to hear, maybe Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So just for background, I started my life as a lawyer in a large commercial law firm in Australia. And certainly what I saw is that clients want to receive competent advice, right? They want to know that their advice is well-rounded and well-considered. And increasingly so, in order to give competent advice, consideration needs to be given to the effects that climate change has, because it alters a great many things, a great many projects or deals that you might do, or, for example, whether or not planning approvals will be, renewed. All these things are affected by the ground and the world in which we live. And so to me, it may not be in every single circumstance that advice needs to consider climate change, but rather that appropriate conception of risk includes climate risk and transition risk, because courts are considering them in particular, and we're seeing a real change in the way that different sectors are operating. So in my mind, it's a matter of just competent lawyering. And if you're not looking more broadly for the effects of climate change, you really risk missing something quite fundamental across the board. And it would be an easy thing to have, only a few lawyers perhaps with expertise in climate, and you would go to them. But the reality is every legal sector is affected. And that's why the guidances that the Law Society of England and Wales will release are really useful. It's also why Net Zero Lawyers Alliance is really useful for law firms, because they have a huge array of resources for particular sectors like tax or conveyancing or M&A, or, to help educate lawyers on how their sector is affected. So I think it's already happening, and it's a matter of, unfortunately, in the future we may have examples of where lawyers miss something and they're made an example of. Now, no one wants to be made an example of, but I suspect it will happen over time with the guidance that we are now seeing from Law Society of England and Wales.
Yeah. No, I think this issue that you're raising of sort of providing competent advice is really important. The issue, of course, is that in order to provide competent advice in relation or in order to assess how the climate transition impacts your client's business or a certain transaction or a litigation matter, you need to have the knowledge, right? You need to have a certain level of awareness and skill. So I think, Alistair, you talked about this need for upskilling. What's the best strategy? Sort of, is it where and who owns it? If we talk about this, I think you all talked about this need to upskill the legal community. Who owns that issue? Is it up to the individual lawyer, or is it the law firms? Is it the bar associations? What do you think, Alistair?
It's a difficult one because obviously climate change requires rapid action, and at the same time it's an unprecedented issue. Lawyers like precedents before they advise on certain things. So you're kind of having to deal with these two tensions at the same time. What I would say is that solicitors should indeed look to see what resources exist out there. A lot of them are free, as said, and obviously that'll depend upon their jurisdiction. After we put out our guidance, what we have seen occur, and this is what we hoped would occur, we are working at the Law Society of England and Wales to run our own capacity building and build certification models and such for our members. And that's something that we can only do at a certain pace. But we've also seen others, large, such as LexisNexis, Reuters, already looking at this issue. We've seen large law firms take our guidance and now are building internal capacity building modules that will be required for certain departments, or indeed perhaps for all of their solicitors, to understand how the guidance applies to their different practice areas. So we've really actually seen the sector grab this with both hands and then start applying it in their own way, developing white papers in different areas on how the guidance affects property and all these different issues. So I think it is, to that end, there is a tension between, who do you lead with the capacity building, or do you raise the standards and then hope that the sector will respond accordingly? I would say that the latter is probably the preferable situation, in the light that lawyers are very intelligent people, as we all know, and they can handle difficult problems as they have done, and any new risks which come, risks brought about by the internet, risks brought about by COVID, all these different areas have required a response. And this is just another area, simply. And to that end, also, we need this to be dealt with in a timely manner as a result of the climate crisis.
Yeah. Maria-Pia, do you want to add anything on this issue of who owns the, who carries responsibility of increasing the climate literacy of commercial lawyers overall?
It's a good question. I think the answer is probably, we have a joint responsibility. I think it is really interesting to hear what the Law Society has done, and I think that's interesting for other bar associations, law societies around the world too, because I think it's one thing perhaps for us, large firms, to figure things out ourselves, but obviously there's a lot of other lawyers who also would benefit from essentially developing their thinking on these matters. And I think in order to get to the wider range of advisors, then I think the bar associations, the law societies around the world probably have an important role to play. But I think maybe the answer is that it's, and I think that's already been touched upon, that you probably have somebody pushing somewhere, and then others follow, and you get the law society with you at some point, and you collaborate. I think that's probably the best way forward.
So thank you. I wanted to sort of make this very concrete, because we both in the survey and more broadly when we talk about our work, and I'm sure that Laura and Alistair, maybe you meet this as well. Like we're met with this attitude among commercial lawyers that, well, I don't work in renewable energy, so the climate transition really doesn't impact my practice area. So I see that this is a very urgent issue, but it doesn't affect me and my clients or my transactions. My little piece of the commercial law universe. So can you give some sort of concrete examples, sort of really down to the nitty-gritty of like what does it look like in different practice areas, not just the obvious ones of climate disputes and renewable energy, but what does it look like for a property lawyer or an M&A lawyer? Where would they come into contact with transition issues? I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Maria-Pia again. Since you're at the ground level with clients.
I think the thing to say, one thing to say about Sweden is that I think we're not as fossil dependent as the UK. I think that's probably part of the reason that perhaps we haven't had quite the sort of spotlight on us yet that some of the UK firms have had. And I think, when I've sort of looked into what we are doing, it is pretty, the things I mentioned before. I mean, we do green bond financings, we help funds establish themselves to become green funds or dark green funds even, and so on and so forth. But it's quite sort of tangible, easy to understand, even for me who are not sort of an expert in the field, in the area. I think there it's probably the case that the UK, for instance, is more, in a way, sophisticated. It's still that the climate change issues will sort of prevail more in all sorts of areas of legal advice. So maybe in fact, Alistair or Laura, for that matter, better.
Yeah, Alistair, you want to see if you can give us some sort of concrete examples of transition issues in different practice areas?
Yeah, no, happy to. So I think it's that light bulb moment that you're looking for, that moment where they connect legal advice to the climate and the risks that come about. We aim to do that with our guidance when we talk about physical risk and how they turn into legal risk or indeed transition risk. So to give a very kind of mundane one and a property example, as you suggested, one way was to go and say, right, okay, so we've got the minimum energy efficiency standards regulations that affect all properties in the United Kingdom, commercial, residential, which have a kind of ratcheting up function, which depending on how energy efficient your house is, depends on whether you can rent out a commercial or residential situation. That is clearly a situation where a lawyer would be advising upon, because that has potential fine implications if you breach that law. Another one might indeed be a conveyancing transaction. As we know through advice provided by our Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the flood maps are telling us that this is becoming an increasing risk in England and Wales. We're seeing through data providers, subsidence, coastal erosion, all these different areas are generating more risks, and that indeed generates people's properties, both residential and commercial. What's the role of the lawyer here to hold on and flag to the client, hey, this information exists, certain research providers are providing this information. This is something that you might want to know before purchasing a property, for instance. It's not that they need to become a technical expert, suddenly advise on these issues. It's about knowing what information exists out there and knowing that the client receives it accordingly. That could also be in a situation where you're a commercial transaction, you're advising upon a contract, and you're implementing certain clauses to make sure that, then they're not going to be frustrated as a result of, a supply chain being disrupted because of, a climate-related risk that is now being relatively established due to the science and all these sort of things. So it's about taking that quite pragmatic, sensible approach and going, right, how is my practice area impacted by climate change? What trends are we seeing growing in the sector, and applying them accordingly? And I think in the next however many years, it will certainly form part of standard practice, as we have seen solicitors tackle other issues such as contaminated land, flood risk in the past. Much the same I can imagine here. So it's really about being ahead of the curve, I think, actually.
Yeah. Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so a few practical examples that I've seen over time. One is in commercial transactions, M&A deals. So if lawyers or law firms are representing buyers or sellers for a particular asset, and over the course of the due diligence process, a data room is created, documents are dumped in there, and then they're coordinated by the corporate team and sent to the different specialized group within the law firm. And, it's all those individual specialized groups' job to look at whether or not their client should buy something or should sell something, right? And so on the buy side, if you're representing a client who's considering buying an asset, for example, if it's an energy asset, coal, oil, gas, or whatnot, one thing I've seen is that in days gone by, there would have been an assumption that the approvals required in order to extract the resource would just be renewed. It wouldn't have been a contentious issue. But more and more, we're seeing in different jurisdictions that it is a huge risk that if an asset or a mine, for example, if their license expires, for example, in 2026, but has a runtime until 2046, and a buyer goes in assuming that license will be renewed for another 20 years, and it isn't, because of climate-related issues and litigation in various courts that challenge those renewals, then your client's looking at a stranded asset for 20 plus years. That's not a good purchase. But if lawyers miss that, and they're less likely to do so now than they were a few years ago, then that's a huge issue. So that's one practical example where different teams within one law firm have to really talk to each other about looking at the various aspects of a transaction and whether or not there are any deal killers.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we are actually out of time. I feel like we have simply sort of touched on many of these issues, and we could certainly keep the conversation going for much longer. So, and that was in some part our idea with this webinar, to further the conversation, to inspire more commercial lawyers to put the climate glasses on and consider how climate change and the transition impacts their practice, right? So I want to thank the speakers, of course, for sharing their knowledge, and please do go to their respective websites and look at some of these resources that they've talked about. There's a lot more out there for those of you who are interested. And I also want to thank our partner, JP Infonet, and as Kajsa said at the beginning of the hour, we have an in-person and web-based training happening in November, on the 16th of November. And then we also have what we call the Law and Climate Summit on April 18th next year. So I hope to see some of you there. And to end, I just wanted to sort of share an experience that I had coming here today. I was riding my bike and I couldn't cross the street to the studio because there was a big demonstration, hundreds of people walking down Old Town here in Stockholm. And it was, of course, it's Friday. Fridays for Future is big in Stockholm. So, but it wasn't just Greta Thunberg who was demonstrating. It was hundreds of people, from Grandmothers for Climate to the most interesting one I saw was the Scientist Rebellion. So my hope is that at some point in the future, we will have a group of lawyers walking in that demonstration with a sign saying, you know, Lawyers for Climate or something like that. So with that said, thank you so much once again to all of you, and to be continued. Thank you.